You can hear a pin drop.
I think we're at about 36. I'm sure we're going to have some people enter, but I think this is good enough to at least begin the introduction, Bob.
Thank you, Dave. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending upon what time zone or where in the world you are. My name is Bob Christie, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Father Keith Beaumont, member of the French Oratorians. And Father Beaumont comes to us today from the south of France. Father Beaumont is the author of the official Newman biography for Newman's beatification in 2010. And he and I have just recently finished co-editing a book of essays based on the joint conference between the Newman Association and Paris French Friends of Newman. One of Father's most recent works is the Spiritual Theology of John Henry Newman, and he will be talking to us today about themes from that work, including the beauty of holiness, which is a recurrent theme in Newman's work. So with that introduction, I turn it over to Father Beaumont.
Thank you very much, Bob. I feel I ought to begin with two brief apologies. This talk has been prepared at very short notice, as you know. It's rather daunting to try to step into the shoes of Ian Carr. I'm also on holiday at the moment in the depths of the French countryside without access to my Newman library. So I've done my best to put things together. Second point, I've written extensively on Newman over the past 20 years, some dozen books if you include editions, translations, several anthologies. But although English is my native language, I've written almost entirely in French. Now I shall try not to forget myself and to lapse into French, but if I do so, I hope you'll forgive me. As Bob said, in some years back, 2014, I published quite a big book, about 500 pages, called in French, Dieu intérieur, la théologie spirituelle de John Henry Newman. An English translation would be God Within, the Spiritual Theology of Newman. It was a vast study comprising some 15 chapters based on Newman's work, based particularly on his sermons, but with reference also to many other works. I'm not going to attempt to summarize this work. We would be here for far too long, and that would be fastidious. I want to stress merely a few salient points, concluding with elements of a chapter on the theme of sanctity or holiness in Newman, entitled The Beauty of Holiness, which is a phrase which he had a great affection for. I want to, just before beginning, I want to make two somewhat polemical comments. The first concerns Newman's sermons. He published 12 volumes of sermons, 10 as an Anglican and 2 as a Catholic. These 12 volumes of sermons represent almost 1/3 of the total number of volumes published by Newman himself. And I find it simply scandalous that in so many academic studies of Newman, they are recorded so little interest. Is the sermon merely a minor literary genre, unworthy of serious academic study? Other than from a purely stylistic viewpoint or from a biographical point of view, as in the recent Newman Handbook, have Newman's sermons really nothing of importance to teach us today regarding our own moral and spiritual lives? Indeed, is spirituality, a word which remains to be defined, of no importance in an academic context? Is it devoid of academic respectability? I don't believe that. And my 2014 book, and most of what I've written on Newman, is based on the premise that Newman is one of the great spiritual masters of our time, and that to neglect this dimension of his thought and his work is to amputate an essential element of that thought and that work. My second rather polemical point is this: too many academic studies of Newman totally fail to take into account the importance of God in his own life. Not just the idea of God, however important that may be, but the experience of God as a living, personal being. I could quote, as an example of this, Frank Turner's massive volume devoted to Newman, of which I once wrote a long 10-page review. Now, Turner, while recognizing the huge amount of research that had gone into the book, I must say I have rarely encountered a book which displays such animosity towards its subject. And above all, I deplored Turner's total failure to take into account the lived experience of God, which is at the very center of Newman's life and thought. Without this, it's simply impossible to understand Newman. A few definitions. First of all, my book is called The Spiritual Theology of Newman. Today, the word theology means a study of God in as systematic and scientific way as possible. In other words, an intellectual pursuit. For Christian tradition, up until the 13th, 14th century, the word had a somewhat different meaning. For the church fathers, for the monastic tradition, the theologian was one who sought God in meditation and in prayer. Right up to the end of the 13th century, the word continues to have this meaning. Even, I would even say especially, in Thomas Aquinas, who never wrote a theological sum. This ancient sense of the word to do with spiritual life, with the relationship with God, with the search for God. Secondly, the terms spiritual and spirituality, words immensely popular today. Everyone seems to want to lay claim to his or own particular spirituality. But the word has taken on such a diversity of meanings that I'm reminded of that famous comment by Humpty Dumpty in Lewis Carroll's Alice Through the Looking Glass. When I use a word, said Humpty Dumpty, it means exactly what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. I think that's pretty true. Okay, right. I just think then the term spiritual theology I use in a particular and very precise sense. It is a theology or theological reflection which is designed to orientate our spiritual lives. To repeat a formula which I often use, our way of thinking about God determines the manner in which we pray to him and seek him, or our inability or our refusal to do so. Hence the importance of having a clear conception of God, an accurate conception of God. Hence the emphasis which Newman places, quite rightly, on dogma. Dogma not in the sense, the pejorative sense in which it's so often used today, but in the sense in which Christian tradition uses it. The dogmas of the church are those formulations by theologians who attempt to sound something of the mystery of God, formulations which are then validated and promulgated by the magisterium. So dogma simply means those guidelines which enable us to enter into relation with God. Newman, in a sense, takes us back to basics. He challenges us to ask what it means to be a Christian. He proposes a definition in one of his Anglican sermons of 1838, the sermon Sincerity and Hypocrisy, which runs as follows. A true Christian may almost be defined as one who has a ruling sense of God's presence within him. A true Christian, or one who is in a state of acceptance with God, is he who, in such sense, has faith in him as to live in the thought that he is present with him, present not externally, not in nature merely, or in providence, but in his innermost heart, or in his conscience. He alone admits Christ into the shrine of his heart, whereas others wish in some way or other to be by themselves, to have a home, a chamber, a tribunal, a throne, a self, where God is not. The true Christian, then, is a man who has, or who seeks to have, within himself, this sense of the presence of God. This will call to mind, for most of you, if not all of you, the famous passage in the Apologia, in Newman alludes, I say alludes rather than describes, his first conversion at the age of 14. The passage ends with the affirmation of his discovery of the existence of two and two only absolute and luminously self-evident beings, myself and my Creator. And this, of course, was written some 50 years after the event, but it's echoed in a much earlier text, a sermon of, I think, 1833, entitled The Immortality of the Soul, which incidentally is only the second sermon in the very first volume of the parochial and plain sermons. I don't need to remind you of the importance of the architecture of the preacher begins by describing how, as we grow up, our attention is absorbed firstly by the world around us, the external world, but then little by little we become aware of inner realities. I quote, "We begin by degrees to perceive that there are but two beings in the whole universe, our own soul and the God who made it. Sublime, unlooked for doctrine, yet most true. To every one of us, there are but two beings in the whole world, himself and God." I should perhaps add that, although this is very personal to Newman, there is absolutely nothing here which is unique to him. Newman links up with and leads us back to a tradition which goes back to the works of biblical authors such as St. Paul and St. John, which runs through the work of all the church fathers, which is at the root of Christian monasticism, and indeed which penetrates Christian theology up until roughly the mid-17th century. During the past 3 or 4 centuries, however, we have terribly intellectualized our conception of Christianity, or rather, we've intellectualized and moralized it to the detriment of its spiritual dimension, which Newman can help us to rediscover. Another point which I'd like to make briefly is a fundamental characteristic of Newman's mind, which I would call the search for connectedness. Newman is far from being simply a spiritual writer and guide. He seeks to connect spirituality and theology, spirituality and morality or ethics, thought and action, the notional and the real, and so on. This is an essential characteristic of his own mind, of the structure of his mind, which he seeks to convey to us. In the idea of a university, he proposes that we see the aim of university education as lying in the acquisition by the student of what he calls a connected view or grasp of things. The emphasis is placed not just on the finished product, so to speak, but also on the process of seeking after connections between different areas of knowledge, ideas, phenomena of all kinds, of what he calls the mutual relations between them. I said this is a characteristic of Newman's mind. It's nicely described by Ian Carr in the words, "The mind of Newman is characterized not by contradictions, but by complementary strengths, so that he may be called without inconsistency, both conservative and liberal, progressive and traditional, cautious and radical, dogmatic yet pragmatic, idealistic but realistic. Equally pertinently, Terence Merrigan speaks of the existence in Newman's mind of a tensile unity, an attempt to hold together apparent opposites in a unity which seeks not to abolish differences, but to maintain them in a fragile but necessary equilibrium. We can see this in his concern, as I mentioned before, with the connection between dogma and spirituality. We can see it in his concern, as I also mentioned, with the relationship between the notional and the real, the relationship between conscience and authority, the connection in his conception of development between change and continuity, the connection between the individual and the church. There's a lovely passage in one of his later Anglican sermons, connection between personal and public improvement, in his sermons on subjects of the day, in which he suggests that the heart of every Christian ought to represent in miniature the Catholic Church, since one Spirit makes both the whole Church and every member of it to be his temple. As he makes the Church one, which, left to itself, would separate into many parts, so he makes the soul one, in spite of its various affections and faculties, and its contradictory aims. And let us be quite sure that these two operations of our divine Comforter depend upon each other, and that while Christians do not seek after inward unity and peace in their own breasts, the Church itself will never be at unity and peace in the world around them. I'm reminded of a rather nice quip by Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who was once asked by a clever journalist, "Tell me, Mother, what is wrong with the Church?" And she looked him in the eye and said, "You and me." There's also the question of the relationship between the theologian, the pastor, and the magisterium, which he explores in the 1877 preface to Volume 1 of the Via Media. There's a connection made many times over in his Anglican sermons between faith and obedience. There's his concern to investigate in the grammar the connections between what he calls natural and revealed religion, and so on. My book then deals with subjects, themes such as these, trying to see how Newman connects all these together, how in particular theology and spirituality connect up. I deal with Newman's own spiritual experience, the role of spiritual experience and aspiration, both in his own conversion of 1845 and in his many reflections on the subject of conversion. I deal with the relationship between faith, morality, and the spiritual life, or the spiritual dimension of faith, the relationship between the moral conscience and consciousness of God. I have a very long chapter on what I'd like to call on Newman's conception of Christian life as what I like to call an ongoing and permanent form of spiritual training. Another on the relationship between the Christian and the world, a relationship between his view of, what I would like to call his spiritual humanism, a chapter on the theological foundations of his spirituality of surrender, and a chapter, and I'm coming to this now, on Newman's conception of sainthood, which I have called the beauty of holiness. And I'd like now to go on, as Bob indicated, to deal with this theme of holiness in Newman's work and explain the origin and the meaning of this formula, the beauty of holiness. As you know, the theme of holiness occupies a major place in the thought and work of Newman. In his progressive discovery of the church of the first centuries, he was a bond of holiness in its members. He sought to create this aspiration to holiness amongst his Anglican co-religionists by organizing the publication of lives of English saints and including these in the liturgical calendar. Faced with the collapse from 1839 onwards of his conception of the Via Media, he appealed more and more in order to justify Anglicanism to the principle of sanctity or holiness. In a letter to the Bishop of Oxford, following the scandal created by Tract 90, he declared that it is the holiness of heart and behavior which recommends us to God. And also, if we are holy, all will be well with us. And finally, that sanctity is the principal characteristic of the church. I'm sorry if these quotations are not absolutely accurate to the word. I'm translating from the French, translating back into English. As a Catholic, he continues to accord the same importance to the theme of holiness in his writings and his teaching. His choice of the oratory of St. Philip Neri was determined not only by the character of the institute founded by Philip, the oratory, but also by the personal holiness of Philip, whom Newman himself adopted as a model and as an intercessor, as his patron saint, in fact. In a Catholic sermon of 1849, he evokes the case of those who are attracted towards what he calls the Catholic religion by, I quote, the evident holiness, the beauty, and I would dare say, the perfume of Catholicism. He even goes so far, he didn't care much for the person of John Wesley, but he even goes so far in his Anglican Difficulties, his lectures of 1850 to former sympathizers of the Oxford movement, as to propose that they see in the figure of Wesley, I quote, the shadow and the suggestion of the supernatural qualities which make up the Catholic conception of sainthood. The first sermon of Newman, as you know, deals specifically, the first published sermon, I should say, and again, the architecture of the volumes of sermons is all important. This first sermon has obviously a programmatic value. He deals precisely with the question of holiness, holiness necessary for future blessedness. He claims that only saints will be admitted at the Last Judgment into the presence of God. He also claims, with a note of wry humor, I think, that if somebody who was not holy were to enter heaven, he would not be happy. In fact, he would be miserable, since holiness is necessary for us to find ourselves blissfully in God's presence. He argues also that to meet God requires a preparation which is not just of a moral or ethical order, but spiritual also. He borrows a number of images from the Church Fathers, Augustine, Athanasius, and others, of the eye which needs to train itself to see the light. Augustine has a wonderful image also of the need to, he likens our soul to a house, saying that if I were to announce my visit, you would hasten to tidy and clean up your place. And yet, God wishes to enter your soul and you do not hasten to clean and tidy that. Newman doesn't explicitly use that image, but I think it's there present in his thought. What is his particular conception of sanctity or holiness? I think his thought undergoes a certain degree of evolution. In his very early sermons, he still seems to be under the influence of his first Calvinist masters. And one finds two traits characteristic of their conception of holiness. The first is that of a separation from the world. The second, rather more important, is the voluntaristic character of this conception of holiness. Holiness is something which we create by our own efforts. There are traces of this in Newman's early sermons. And if we're speaking of a voluntarist conception of holiness, we're also speaking, by definition, of an essentially moral conception of it. People aim at an ideal of moral perfection and seek to make themselves holy by their own efforts. This conception of holiness was absolutely typical of Christians in the West in Newman's time, whether Catholic or Protestant.
We'll see what our tech people can do.
All right, Father Keith, you're back.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, I'll pick up where I left off.
Yeah,
okay?
it was getting so good. So.
Yep. Okay. So Newman's conception of holiness, I think, presents 5 characteristics which are worth underlining. First of all, holiness is the complete opposite of all forms of self-sufficiency and self-satisfaction, since it is dependence upon God. Secondly, the quest for holiness is an essentially solitary affair, not in the sense that it causes us to turn our back on other people, but because, as Newman puts it, in religious matters, everyone must begin, progress, and finish for himself. He cannot make another man wise or holy by his own progress in wisdom or holiness. Thirdly, holiness is so little to be identified with moral perfection that even the greatest saints, according to Newman, manifest failings, defects, or incoherences, inconsistencies in their behavior. And he gives a number of examples of this. Between sin and grace, which is the source of holiness. According to Newman, I quote, "We do not know what sin is because we do not know what God is. We have no standard with which to compare it till we know what God is. Only God's glories, his perfections, his holiness, his majesty, his beauty can teach us by the contrast how to think of sin. And since we do not see God here, till we see him, we cannot form a just judgment of what sin is. Till we enter heaven, we must take what God tells us of sin, mainly on faith." He even goes so far as to say that sin is for his conversion. He was, I quote, "better fitted than another to persuade his brethren as he had been persuaded, and to preach the holy doctrine which he had despised. Not that sin is better than obedience, or the sinner better than the just, but that God in his mercy makes use of sin against itself, that he turns past sin into a present benefit, that while he washes away its guilt and subdues its power, he leaves it in the penitent in such sense as enables him, from his knowledge of its devices, to assault it more vigorously and strike at it more truly when it meets him in other men." And finally, on that point, let me just find the quotation. Yes, one of the themes of my book is what I like to call Newman's spiritual humanism. He lived in a time still in the Catholic Church, still much infected by Jansenism, with its very pessimistic view of mankind, its very pessimistic view of human nature, and its obsession with sin. Now, Newman himself is at times seems to be almost obsessed by sin, but he always allows that grace is greater than sin, that grace can overcome sin. And he repeats on several occasions the old scholastic dictum, gratia perfecit naturam. Grace is not opposed to nature, but grace brings it to perfection by transforming it from within. And there's a lovely passage in one of his Catholic sermons in which he describes how God creates a saint from a sinner. He takes him as he is and uses him against himself. He turns his affections into another channel and extinguishes a carnal love by infusing a heavenly charity, not as if he used him as a mere irrational creature who is impelled by instincts and governed by external incitements without any will of his own, and to whom one pleasure is the same as another, the same in kind though different in degree. I have already said it is the very triumph of his grace that he enters into the heart of man and persuades it and prevails with it while he changes it. He violates in nothing that original constitution of mind which he gave to man. He treats him as man. He leaves him the liberty of acting this way or that. He appeals to all his powers and faculties, to his reason, to his prudence, to his moral sense, to his conscience. He instructs him in the depravity of sin as well as in the mercy of God. Finally, the theme of the beauty of holiness. It's a formula which one finds about a dozen times in Newman's writings, and which obviously fascinated him. It's a formula which he found in the King James Bible and in the liturgical translation of the Psalms in the Book of Common Prayer. This expression, as I say, can be found almost a dozen times. I've counted 11 times, but I've probably missed some. And in an even greater number of passages, one finds an association between the words holiness and beauty and other terms. What are the sources of this idea, apart from its obvious, the origin of the formula in the Protestant tradition? Newman doubtless found inspiration in several of the Church Fathers who developed the theme of God as supreme beauty or absolute beauty. He had himself a keen aesthetic sense, which his correspondence gives us ample evidence of. And he was doubtless sensitive also to the beauty of the liturgy, although he was in no sense a liturgist in the sense that of some of the young aesthetes whom he mocks ferociously in his novel Loss and Gain, the young aesthetes who waxed enthusiastic about the complexities of the ritual, the beauty of song, etc., etc. As I said, in addition to the formula itself, the two words beauty and holiness are very often areas. The quality of life required of the Christian, the Church, the Holy Virgin, and above all, God, whose beauty constitutes an attribute which Newman many times underlines. And then there are other terms associated with these two words, with the term beauty, one finds associated words like glory, purity, harmony, and power. With holiness, one finds words such as perfection, light, happiness, piety, obedience, justice, faith, and new birth. A few conclusions from all of this. In the second reflection, or rather one should say precursor of this declaration. Secondly, in the, sorry, I think I've dealt with this point already. He declares that it is the beauty of God which enables us to take full measure of the ugliness of sin. In the old catechisms, all too often, they began with sin and ended with holiness. Newman declares that the link really should be the other way around. Thirdly, if the young Newman, as I said before, sometimes seems to express a very voluntaristic and moralistic conception of holiness, more and more he comes to see both beauty and holiness as a gift from God, which we are invited to receive and to welcome in us. Fourthly, far from this entailing a pure passivity, many people are touched at one point or another in their lives. Sorry, start that again. This is far from implying a pure passivity. Many men, says Newman, are touched at one moment or another in their lives by grace, but few arrive at true holiness. And the reason is that if holiness is the fruit of the presence and the work of the Holy Spirit in us, we must wish this presence and facilitate this work. As the gospel puts it, many are called, but few are chosen, because few choose to be chosen. As so often in Newman, everything depends on God, but at the same time, it depends on us and on our will. Fifthly, beauty in all its forms, says Newman, is a force of attraction, and this applies particularly to the beauty of holiness. True saints, says Newman, exercise a kind of mysterious attraction mixed with fascination, and they attract other men thanks to the inner power which dwells in them, a power which is also a form of beauty. And this is a particular form of Newman's principle of personal influence. And this attraction, this fascination exercised by personal holiness is brilliantly illustrated in Newman's writings by two saints, his two favorite saints, of whom he several times gives us a portrait, St. Paul and St. Philip Neri. And in two of his Catholic sermons devoted to St. Paul, in which he gives us a portrait of St. Paul's characteristic gift, and St. Paul's gift of sympathy, we have a double portrait, perhaps even a treble portrait, of St. Paul, of St. Philip, and doubtless also to an extent of John Henry Newman. Finally, it is through the saints and through the beauty of their holiness that God acts in history. If we want to see the hand of God in the work, in the affairs of men, declares Newman, we must look at his saints. We must look at those who are filled with this presence of the Holy Spirit, the sanctifying Spirit. The apostles, he said, were such men, but many others could be named from different periods of history as their successors in holiness. They communicate their light to a great number of lesser luminaries who distribute it in their turn through the whole world. The source of inspiration remains all this time visible, and yet, however invisible, is the author of this light. It and he are there. A small number of men, says Newman, having received a few highly endowed men, will save the world for centuries to come. And I will make a concluding mark. Dostoevsky is reported to have said that beauty will save the world. For Newman, it is rather holiness that will save the world and us. Thank you very much.
Father Keith, you're getting a lot of seal clapping. You're getting very good trained seals. That's what the Newman Association is really good at. It's a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. We have about 15 or 20 minutes for Q&A if you're available for that.
Yes, yeah, by all means.
And all I would ask is if you're going to ask a question, please unmute yourself first and then ask the question.
The floor is open. Well, I'll start it off, Father. Thank you very much for that. And a recurring theme in what you had to say was this experience of presence as part of the experience of holiness, the presence of God within. And what I'm very curious about is, are you familiar with how Newman described that presence? How would we identify it to perhaps say distinguish it from any other, let's say, false sense of presences? How would we know that we are having an experience of the presence of God? Does Newman address that at all?
Yes, he does, at least indirectly. He, you probably know of his relationship to Anglican evangelicalism in his time. He's much influenced by it. He was marked for life by certain aspects of it. But he grew increasingly mistrustful of the emotionalism of many evangelicals. And he saw this emotionalism, this extreme emotionalism, as a kind of false spirituality. He declared also that humility is one of the chief characteristics of the saint. I think there is no clearer indication that one is not a saint than the fact of the fact of proclaiming it to be so. All true saints, says Newman, ignore that they are such, and they refuse to be called such. You perhaps know the wonderful comment of Newman when a rather over-enthusiastic correspondent described him as a saint. He said, "Don't be ridiculous. Saints don't write novels." I may have a certain culture behind me, but that's not the same thing as being what I describe or write about. A true example of sainthood is St. Philip Neri, and I'm not even worthy to blacken his shoes in heaven. That's a very brief answer. A lot more can be said on the subject, but
thank you.
You're welcome.
Father Keith, I wanted to,
that Father Juan?
Father Juan.
Hello, Juan. Hello.
Hello, Father Keith. Good to see you. I want to thank you for breaking open for us this the category of holiness in Newman as a subject for academic study. I think it's so important. Of course, his sermons but his letters, his friendships, and I think so much has to be done to study that, and also his life of prayer. Even though I'm interested in that, I feel that I know very little about his life of prayer, and I've read a lot about Newman, and I have devotion to him and invoke him. But his life of prayer, his Eucharistic life, and all this is a subject for academic study. But not only something abstract. I don't want to repeat what you've said, but I want to thank you for that, and I find that as an important challenge. So I want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you indeed.
Father Keith, thank you. This is Brian Hughes speaking. So much I've been listening to Richard Rohr and reading Thomas Merton. Wow, he was ahead of them.
Yes.
That's amazing. It's just amazing. You can read Newman and see the traces of Merton and even Rohr today were immensely popular. It's just fascinating how fecund his thought is.
But these men are all part of the same tradition, the same insights, which run through 2,000 years of Christianity, often expressed in different ways. But the underlying insights, I think, are there. Did you say Brian Hughes?
Yes.
Yes. We've corresponded, Brian.
We have.
Yeah, and it's nice to see you in the flesh. In a manner of speaking.
Likewise. But I'll let others ask questions. I just wanted to make that.
Thank you.
Father, can I ask a question regarding Newman's long entry into the church and the notion of surrender? To me, one of his great virtues is surrender, as is all the saints. Can you talk about surrender in Newman?
Sorry, can I say a word about it?
Yes, please do. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. It's a word which doesn't necessarily go down well in the States in a very activist culture, such as American culture. I think a lot of American Christianity is extremely active. I remember even Thomas More comments on this amongst the monks of Gethsemane. They're always doing things or wanting to do things. I think the point, the ultimate teaching of Newman is that we must surrender ourselves to God and allow God to work in us. But at the same time, this is anything but a kind of namby-pamby, I can't think of the right words, but it involves an extraordinary effort on our part to make ourselves receptive. All the great saints, I think, are men of extreme willpower. They're anything but purely passive. And I think this surrender is the result of a struggle, constant struggle throughout our lives, to open ourselves up to God and to allow Him to work within us. It's a very brief answer, sorry, but.
Can I ask something, Father? My name is Marial Corona, and something that fascinates me about Newman is how His Holiness is not only recognized by the Catholic Church, but he was also very, very well respected by the Anglican Church that he left. And it seems that many different people are able to recognize some of his greatness. So if you can comment on how he was able to appeal to so many different crowds of people. It seems to me that today, some people have one hero and another group of people have the anti-hero, and we're just like so divided. But Newman was able to reach a lot of different groups. So could you comment on that, please?
I think it's his own deep humanity, which is the can even go so far as to see the point of view.
Starting again, sorry, you broke down after his humanity, and I didn't hear.
Sorry, he has an extraordinary sense of empathy for other people. He can even sympathize with the arguments of opponents, to the point where he's actually been accused quite falsely of losing his faith because he could understand the point of view of opponents of that faith. And I think it's this broadness of humanity that makes him such an inspiration and such a source of inspiration.
Father Keith, can I you had brought up Frank Turner earlier on,
Yeah.
and I do, in your comments, I read it in one of, maybe it was your review, that you make such a great point about that his sermons are infrequently studied. They're not brought into conversation with his other intellectual works. But I wanted the last comment you made. Let's say the tradition that has come forth from Frank Turner would not see Newman necessarily as being sympathetic and empathetic, but people like Simon Skinner would call him Machiavellian and others. What do you think about that? I mean, what's your take on? In other words, there seems to be a rift in interpreting Newman, as some see him as human, all too human, in almost a Nietzschean sense, and others see this a humanity that's both messy and approachable. I think he's a very approachable saint. Partly is because we know so much of, we have so much of his correspondence, but I would be interested to hear your view on kind of these different interpretive kind of schools, some that do not see Newman in a very positive light that could unify folks, as Marielle brings up.
An awful lot of Newman scholarship in the past has been hagiographic. The classic example of that is the biography by, what's her name, Muriel Trevor. Newman cannot set a foot wrong, everything Newman does. And there's obviously been a reaction against that. And up to a point, it is a salutary reaction, because Newman had his faults like everybody else, often quite grave faults in some ways. He sometimes found it hard to forgive. But as he himself maintains, sainthood is not perfection. It's far from perfection. And the other point I think to be made is there's been a lot of work in recent years on the what's the word, on what's called contextualization, seeing Newman in his context. And this is a very healthy approach, provided that it does not end in animosity for the subject. Turner's book is very strong on context, but vitiated, I think, by this extraordinary dislike for his subject. And I think we have to be honest and admit Newman's faults and say, okay, but let's not exaggerate them. Let's not go from adulation to calumny.
Thank you.
Father Keith, I was going to ask you, I have in mind that beautiful little piece in Meditations and Devotions where Newman talks about holiness being no more than fulfilling the round of the day, getting up on time,
yeah,
saying your rosary. And then I also think about Catherine Doherty in Madonna House movement and their emphasis on responding to the duty of the moment. And I think about Therese of Lisieux and her little way. And I'm wondering if there's something about being faithful in the ordinariness round of the day and responding to the little calls that seems to appear here that would be part of your understanding of Newman's way of holiness.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Newman proposes a form of holiness for ordinary, everyday people. To some, it may appear banal, but it's realistic. Newman is extraordinarily realistic in his appreciation of people and situations.
He's not unmuting.
Hello?
Father Keith, here we are.
Yeah. The connection seems to be getting more and more unstable, so I think we perhaps need to wind it up if that's okay.
What, Father, do you remember what you were saying to answer, to finish off the question from Don Graham? That's where we lost you. You were about to say the most amazing words in the history of words, and then Zoom, it's conspiracy. Zoom, every time you're about to do something amazing, Zoom cuts you off. This is on Zoom.
Yeah. I think that the last question, I think, was about Newman's conception of holiness in everyday life and for ordinary people. And I think that's a great source of inspiration to all of us. Once again, holiness is not moral perfection. It doesn't exist. The saints all have their failings. And we have to accept this.
Thank you very much, Father. It was a great answer.
Okay, well,
it's just about time, and we don't want to risk losing the connection again, Dave. So I think it's about the wrap-up point. What do you say?
Here's my suggestion. Let's all unmute and give Father Beaumont a hand so we can all hear him, so we don't look like just trained seals. So you can unmute, and we'll do a live clapping for Father.
I would just like to point out that when Father Carr became suddenly unavailable just 48 hours ago, we put out an urgent SOS call to Father Beaumont, and he so graciously responded on short notice to join us today. So we're especially appreciative of that, Father.
Absolutely.
Oh, you're most welcome. You're most welcome.
Thank you, Father. And
Thank you.
Just while we have everybody here for 1 second, some people have asked about getting recordings for the conference that they didn't sign up for it initially, but now they want them. We're later this afternoon. There should be a button. If you go to the our website, there will be a button on the conference page where you can purchase these recordings. It's only a $10 purchase on PayPal, or if you would like to email me at the email address that we gave for the conference. And if you want to send a check to the Newman Association to do it, we're putting together we're putting together right now the recordings, and we'll be able to send you links to download. We're also going to clean them up a little bit. So where we had pauses in this, we're going to try to at least clean this keynote up so that we can make sure that everything that, it's not as choppy with Father Keith. But again, thank you so much, Father Keith, and Bob for making this happen. And we are going to pause now. We have until it's 11:30 Central, so 12:30 on the East Coast. At 1:30, we'll resume the conferences again.
Okay, thank you all.
Much. And,
thank you.
Especially thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. And I hope the conference goes well.
Thank you, Father.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right, let's vacate the